Dust caked her throat, tasting of copper and failure. Kara pushed a matted curl from her forehead, staring at her two shivering girls. A shadow blocked the brutal afternoon sun, a man smelling of wood smoke and raw hide. He wasn't a savior. He was just the only chance left. Alkali dust has a way of working into the creases of a person's skin until they look like a corpse long before they stop breathing. Kara sat on the splintered tongue of the Conestoga wagon, rubbing a filthy thumb across the back of her hand. The skin felt like old parchment. Beside her, huddled beneath a moth-eaten woolen blanket, were Sarah and May, 5 and 7 years old. They hadn't asked for water in 12 hours. That was worse than the crying. 3 days ago, the rear axle had snapped in a dry wash, dropping 3 tons of oak and iron onto her husband's chest. The ground had been too hard to dig a proper grave. Kara had piled stones over him, her fingernails tearing backward to the quick, leaving smears of blood on the gray shale. Then, the single remaining ox had wandered off into the scrub, taking their last canteen strapped to its harness. Now, there was just the wind. It whined through the canvas canopy, a thin, reedy sound that grated against the inside of Kara's skull. She rested her head against the rough wood of the wagon. Her stomach had stopped cramping yesterday, replaced by a cold, hollow nausea. She closed her eyes. She just wanted to sleep. It would be so easy to close her eyes and let the freezing night air do the rest. But then May coughed a dry, rattling hack that shook the little girl's bird-like frame. Kara's eyes snapped open. The instinct to mother, raw and irrational, spiked through her exhaustion. She stood up, her knees popping, the coarse wool of her skirts heavy with dried mud. That was when she heard the crunch of gravel. It wasn't the rhythmic thud of an ox or the chaotic clatter of a stagecoach. It was a slow, deliberate scuffing, boot steps, and the heavier, sharper click of a shod hoof. She stumbled around the side of the wagon. A man was walking down the slope of the dry wash, leading a soot-colored mule. He didn't look like the cavalrymen she'd seen at Fort Laramie, and he didn't look like the hopeful sodbusters heading west. He looked like something the mountains had chewed up and spat out. He wore greasy buckskin that hung off his broad frame, stained dark with dried blood and pine pitch. A heavy beard, the color of dirty straw, obscured the lower half of his face. A rifle rested casually over his right shoulder. He stopped about 20 yards away. The wind shifted, carrying his scent to her rancid bear fat, wet wool, and old sweat. Kara didn't care. To her, he smelled like life. He didn't say a word. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, swept over the broken wagon, the pile of rocks, and finally settled on Kara. He didn't look shocked or pitying. He looked inconvenienced. He spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the dust, shifted his grip on the mule's lead rope, and started to walk past. He was going to leave them. The realization hit Kara like a physical blow. Panic, hot and feral, clawed up her throat. "Wait!" The word tore out of her, ragged and harsh. He didn't stop. His heavy boots continued to grind into the alkali. "Please!" Kara scrambled forward. Her worn leather shoes slipped on the loose shale, and she went down hard, skinning her palms and knees. She didn't feel the sting. She scrambled up, lunging toward him, grabbing a fistful of his greasy leather sleeve. He stopped then. He turned his head slowly, looking down at her hand as if it were a rat gnawing on his coat. "Let go, ma'am," he said. His voice sounded like rocks grinding together at the bottom of a river, deep, abrasive. Kara dropped her hand, but she stepped in front of him, blocking his path. She was shaking violently, though the sun was still high. She looked into his eyes, searching for a flicker of decency, a shred of Christian charity. She saw nothing but a hard, flat wall of indifference. He was a survivor. Survivors didn't carry dead weight. She knew she was dead weight. She was 26, but right now she looked 50. She had no food, no money, and no strength left to walk. She would not survive a trek to the nearest settlement, which was at least a week away. But the girls... Kara turned her head. Sarah and May were peering around the wagon wheel, 2 sets of wide, hollow eyes staring out from dirt-streaked faces. Kara turned back to the mountain man. Her chest heaved. The last of her pride, the polite, civilized woman she had been in Ohio, fractured and blew away in the Wyoming wind. She fell to her knees in the dirt. Take my children, she sobbed. The man blinked, a slow, deliberate movement. His brow furrowed slightly. What? Take them! Kara choked out, tears finally cutting pale tracks through the grime on her cheeks. She grabbed his pant leg, feeling the rough, unyielding leather under her bleeding fingers. Please! They're small. They don't eat much. They can walk, I promise. Sarah can work. She can mend things. Just take them to a fort, to a town, anyone. Drop them at a church. Ma'am, get up. He tried to pull his leg away, a flash of genuine discomfort crossing his rugged features. No! Kara's voice cracked into a shriek. I can't make it. I know I can't. But they can. Don't let them die out here watching me rot. Take my children. She slumped forward, her forehead hitting his dust-covered boot. She wept, the sound ugly and guttural. It wasn't a heroic sacrifice. It was the pathetic, broken begging of an animal backed into a corner. She hated herself for it. She hated him for making her do it. But she pressed her face against his boot, her hands clutching his ankle, waiting for him to kick her away. The wind howled, rattling the dry sagebrush. Above her, the man let out a long, heavy exhale that sounded like a curse. Jedediah stood frozen, staring down at the woman weeping on his boots. He hated the flats. He came down from the timberline twice a year to trade pelts for powder and coffee, and every time, the plains reminded him why he preferred the company of wolves. The plains were full of people, and people were full of misery. He looked at the two little girls peeking from behind the shattered wagon wheel. They looked like starved rabbits. Then he looked down at the woman. She was trembling so hard, her spine looked ready to snap. Her hair was a tangled rat's nest of brown, and the back of her neck was blistered raw by the sun. He felt a familiar, ugly tightening in his chest. He lived alone by strict design. You care for something out here, it gets taken. You carry extra weight, you die. Taking two brats and leaving the mother to get picked over by coyotes wasn't just bad luck. It was a curse he'd have to carry in his head. I ain't a wet nurse, Jed muttered, glaring out at the horizon. The woman just sobbed harder, her fingers digging tighter into the leather of his leggings. God damn it, Jed growled, spitting another stream of tobacco. He reached down, grabbing the collar of her ruined dress, and hauled her to her feet with one arm. She weighed next to nothing. She dangled there for a second, her eyes squeezed shut, bracing for a blow. Jed set her on her feet. She swayed, her eyes fluttering open, confused and terrified. You think I'm going to haul two squalling pups across the divide while their May turns into buzzard bait? He snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. You think I want them waking up screaming every night because I left you here? Kara stared at him, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly. Gather what you got, Jed barked, turning away to secure his mule. Flour, salt, blankets, leave the rest. We got 3 hours of daylight, and I aim to be in the foothills before we camp. Kara just stood there, her brain short-circuiting. You'll take them? Jed stopped, his hand resting on the mule's pack saddle. He turned his head, his pale eyes pinning her to the spot. I ain't taking times them. I said gather your things. You're all coming with me. Kara's breath hitched. I can't walk. Then you'll crawl, Jed said, his tone entirely devoid of sympathy. Or you'll die on the trail. But you ain't dying by my boots. Now move. The sheer violence of his command cut through her exhaustion. It was an order, not an offer of salvation. Fear of this feral, angry man momentarily eclipsed her physical weakness. She stumbled toward the wagon. For the next 20 minutes, the camp was a flurry of chaotic, strained movement. Jed stepped into the wagon and began tossing things out with ruthless efficiency. Kara watched in horror as he threw her grandmother's china pitcher onto the dirt, where it shattered. What are you doing? She cried out. Wait, Jed grunted. He tossed a heavy cast-iron skillet next, then a trunk of clothes. He found a half-empty sack of flour and a tin of lard. He tossed those to Kara, put 'em in a sack. He stripped the wagon of anything useful for survival ammunition, 2 wool blankets, a handful of dried beans, and strapped them to his already burdened mule. He didn't offer a hand to the girls. He didn't try to comfort them. He just loomed over them, smelling of grease and dirt, until they scurried to Kara's side. Walk behind the mule, Jed commanded, pulling a pocket watch from his vest, checking it, and shoving it back. Don't fall behind. I don't wait. He didn't look back to see if they obeyed. He simply started walking toward the distant, jagged line of mountains, jutting up against the bruised sky. Kara grabbed Sarah's hand and pushed May in front of her. "Walk," she whispered, her voice cracking. The first hour was a blur of agony. The muscles in Kara's legs screamed, tightening with every step in the shifting gravel. The alkali dust kicked up by Jed and the mule coated her lungs, making every breath a chore. She kept her eyes fixed on the back of Jed's buckskin coat. A grease stain near his left shoulder became the center of her universe. If she lost sight of it, she would die. May started crying silently in the second hour, her little shoulders hitching. Kara wanted to pick her up, but she knew if she bent down, she would never stand back up. Up ahead, the rhythmic scuff of Jed's boots didn't change. He walked with a relentless, ground-eating stride. He seemed completely unaware of them, a machine of leather and muscle. But Kara noticed something. The terrain was shifting. They were leaving the flat, open scrubland and entering a dry, rocky ravine that led up toward the foothills. The ground here was uneven, littered with ankle-breaking stones. Jed slowed. It wasn't obvious. He didn't look back, but the distance between them stopped growing. He was pacing himself to the limping gait of a starving woman and 2 children, though he would never admit it. As the sun sank below the ridgeline, the temperature plummeted. The sweat on Kara's back turned to ice. Her teeth began to chatter, a loud, uncontrollable clicking in the silence. Jed finally stopped in a small clearing surrounded by ancient, wind-twisted juniper trees. "Camp," he grunted, dropping the mule's lead. Kara collapsed instantly. She didn't mean to. Her knees simply buckled, and she hit the hard dirt, pulling Sarah down with her. She lay there, staring at the gray sky, her chest heaving, waiting for the dark edges of her vision to close in permanently. She heard the snap of branches, the strike of flint. A minute later, the sharp, pungent smell of burning juniper smoke drifted over her. A heavy boot nudged her shoulder. Not a kick, just a firm pressure. "Sit up," Jed's rough voice demanded. Kara dragged herself upright, groaning. Jed had a fire going. He squatted next to it, pulling a strip of black, leathery meat from a pouch. He tossed it into her lap. "Venison jerky. Chew it slow, or you'll puke it back up." He didn't wait for a thank you. He turned away, tending to his mule, his broad back, an impenetrable wall. Kara picked up the jerky. It felt like tree bark. She tore off a small piece with her teeth, the salty, smoky flavor hitting her tongue like a physical shock. She broke off 2 smaller pieces and handed them to the girls, who took them with trembling, filthy hands. As they sat in the dirt, chewing the tough meat, Kara watched the mountain man across the fire. He was cleaning his rifle, his face illuminated by the dancing orange flames. He was terrifying. He was rude. He was completely devoid of grace. But as the heat of the fire began to seep into her freezing bones, Kara realized something, and a strange, contradictory knot tightened in her chest. Her husband had been a gentle man, full of poetry and dreams of golden wheat fields. And he had gotten them killed. This man, smelling of blood and dirt, angry at the world he was keeping them alive. Morning came not with a gentle sunrise, but with a creeping, bone-deep gray. Kara woke shivering, her teeth grinding together. Frost coated the edges of the wool blanket Jed had thrown over them during the night. She sat up, her joints popping like dry kindling. Her dress was stiff with frozen mud. Jed was already awake. He was tying a heavy canvas tarp over the mule's load, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He didn't offer a morning greeting. He just kicked dirt over the smoldering ashes of the fire and pointed up the steep, timbered slope. "Move," he said. They climbed. The transition from the high plains to the mountains was brutal. The air grew thin, scraping at the back of Kara's throat with every inhale. The ground shifted from loose shale to a treacherous carpet of slick, rust-colored pine needles and jagged roots. By noon, the smell of sagebrush was gone, replaced by the sharp, medicinal scent of spruce and the damp decay of rotting logs. Kara's thin leather shoes, already battered by the flats, began to disintegrate. The stitching on the left toe gave way, exposing her woolen stocking to the sharp rocks. With every step, a fresh spike of pain shot up her calf. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted iron, refusing to make a sound. If she complained, he might leave them. She genuinely believed that. Behind her, May was stumbling. The 5-year-old's small hand gripped Sarah's tightly, but her legs were giving out. "Mama," May whimpered, a thin, reedy sound that barely carried over the wind. "My legs hurt." "Just a little further, sweetie," Kara rasped, not turning around. If she turned, she'd lose her momentum. "Just keep your eyes on my back." They made it another 100 yards before May collapsed. It wasn't a dramatic fall. She simply folded into the pine needles like a dropped marionette, her chest heaving. Sarah tried to pull her up, but Sarah was crying now too, her face smeared with snot and dirt. Kara turned. Panic flared hot in her stomach. She lunged awkwardly back down the slope, her ruined shoe slipping. She fell to her knees beside May, grabbing the girl's thin shoulders. "May, get up, please. You have to get up." Kara's voice was frantic, breathless. She tried to lift the child, but her own arms shook violently. She had no leverage. She had no strength. A shadow fell over them. Jed stood there, leaning heavily on his rifle. He looked down at the pathetic pile of weeping women and children. His jaw worked, a hard lump of muscle ticking beneath his beard. "I told you," Jed said, his voice flat. "I don't wait." Kara looked up at him, her eyes wild, cornered. "I'll carry her. Just give me a minute. Just 1 minute." She tried to haul May up against her chest, but her boots slipped on the pine needles and she fell backward, her shoulder slamming into a rock. The pain was blinding, a sickening crunch that stole her breath. She lay there, gasping, staring up at the canopy of dark pine branches. She had failed. It was over. Jed spat a dark stream of tobacco onto the snow-dusted ground. He unslung his rifle, leaning it against a spruce trunk. Then he stepped forward. He didn't speak to Kara. He reached down and grabbed May by the back of her coat. He hoisted the terrified little girl into the air with one massive arm, ignoring her panicked squeak. He carried her over to the mule, shoving a sack of flour to the side, and plopped May down roughly onto the wooden crossbuck of the pack saddle. "Hold the ropes," Jed commanded, pulling a piece of rawhide to tie her little waist to the rigging. "You let go, you break your neck." May, too stunned to cry, gripped the coarse hemp ropes with white knuckles. Jed walked back to Kara. He stood over her. "Get up." Kara rolled onto her side, crying silently from the pain in her shoulder and the overwhelming, humiliating relief. She struggled to her feet, leaning against a tree to steady herself. Jed's pale eyes dropped to her feet. He stared at her torn shoe, the bloody mud-caked stocking protruding from it. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't ask if she was all right. "Walk on the outside of your foot," he grunted, turning back to retrieve his rifle. "Takes the pressure off the toe." That night, they camped in a shallow cave beneath a massive granite overhang. The wind howled outside, driving a bitter, stinging sleet against the rocks. But inside, it was dry. The fire crackled, casting long, erratic shadows against the stone. Kara sat near the back, her knees pulled to her chest. Her left foot throbbed with a rhythmic, sickening heat. She gingerly untied the ruined shoe and peeled back the wet, filthy stocking. The bottom of her foot was a mess of burst blisters and raw, torn flesh. Blood and dirt were ground deep into the wounds. She heard a heavy footstep. Jed dropped a tin cup on the stone beside her. Hot water splashed over the rim. "Clean it," he ordered. He didn't walk away this time. He sat heavily on a nearby boulder, pulling a small leather pouch from his belt. Kara dipped a torn strip of her petticoat into the steaming water. She flinched, biting back a groan as the hot water hit the raw meat of her heel. She scrubbed at the dirt, her hands shaking. "You're doing it wrong," Jed muttered. He stood up, crossing the small space. Without asking permission, he knelt in front of her. He grabbed her ankle. His hand was enormous, his skin feeling like coarse grit sandpaper. He smelled heavily of wet wool, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of old blood. Kara stiffened, a surge of instinctual modesty making her try to pull her leg back. "I can do it." "Hold still," he snapped, his grip tightening. It wasn't a gentle touch, but it was incredibly steady. He took the rag from her trembling fingers. He didn't look at her face. He focused entirely on the mangled foot. He scrubbed the dirt out with a ruthlessness that made Kara whimper, but she forced herself to stay still. Once it was clean, he opened his pouch. He dug out a glob of dark, sticky pine pitch mixed with something that smelled faintly of crushed mint. He smeared it over the raw flesh. The sting was immediate and fiery, followed by a strange, numbing coolness. He wrapped her foot in a clean strip of soft buckskin, tying it off tight. He dropped her ankle. "Keep it dry." He stood up and walked back to the fire, sitting down with his back to her. Kara stared at his broad shoulders. Her foot throbbed, but the sharp, stabbing agony was gone. She looked at her dirty hands, then at her sleeping girls, huddled under a blanket near the fire. She realized she was staring at Jed's back not with fear, but with a strange, heavy reliance that terrified her far more than the Wyoming wilderness ever could. The snow started falling heavily the next afternoon. It wasn't the light, dry powder of the plains. It was heavy, wet mountain snow that clung to everything, weighing down the pine boughs and soaking through Kara's thin dress. They reached the cabin just as the gray daylight died entirely. It wasn't a home. It was a shelter. Built from thick, unpeeled logs, it sat wedged tightly into the side of a steep ravine, protected from the worst of the wind. A heavy sod roof dripped with melting snow. Jed pushed the heavy plank door open. The smell hit Kara instantly, musty earth, old wood ashes, and the sharp, gamey scent of cured hides. It was pitch black inside. "Get in," Jed ordered, shoving her lightly between her shoulder blades. Kara stumbled inside, pulling the girls with her. It was freezing, but the sudden absence of the biting wind felt like a physical embrace. Jed followed, dropping the mule's lead rope outside and kicking the door shut. He struck a match. The flare of yellow light revealed a single room. A stone hearth dominated one wall. A crude wooden table and a single chair sat in the center. In the corner, a bed frame built from raw timber was piled thick with bear and wolf pelts. Jed lit a kerosene lantern hanging from a beam. The yellow light cast stark, ugly shadows across his face. He looked exhausted. The lines around his eyes were carved deep, his beard caked with frost. "Sit," he told them, pointing to the bed. Kara led the girls to the corner. The pelts were stiff and smelled fiercely of animal, but as she pressed her hand into them, they were incredibly thick and dry. She pulled Sarah and May onto the bed, wrapping the heavy furs around them. They sank into the warmth, their eyes heavy and glazed. Jed didn't stop moving. He brought in an armful of split wood from a stack by the door and built a fire. Within minutes, flames were roaring in the hearth, casting a fierce, baking heat into the small room. He brought in the sacks of supplies, dropping them heavily on the table. Kara watched him, her heart beating a slow, nervous rhythm against her ribs. They were here. But what now? "When?" Kara started, her voice cracking. She swallowed hard, trying to sound stronger than she felt. "When do we leave for the fort?" Jed stopped digging through a sack of flour. He didn't look at her. He stared into the fire. "We don't," he said. The silence in the cabin felt heavier than the snow outside. "What do you mean?" Kara asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Jed turned slowly. He leaned against the heavy oak table, crossing his massive arms over his chest. "Pass is closed. Storm's setting in early. Snow will be 10 feet deep in the gorge by morning. Ain't nobody crossing the divide till the spring thaw." Kara stared at him. The reality of his words crashed over her, suffocating and complete. Spring thaw. That was 5 months away. 5 months locked in a single room with a man who barely spoke, who looked at her with thinly veiled irritation, who smelled of grease and death. "You brought us here," she accused, panic edging her voice. "You said you'd take us to a town." "I said I'd keep you breathing," Jed corrected harshly. "You try walking to the settlement now, you'll be a frozen block of meat by sunrise. You want to take your pups out in that?" He jerked his chin toward the heavy timber door. The wind was howling against it, rattling the iron latch. Kara looked at the door. Then she looked at the bed. Sarah and May were already asleep, buried under the bear hides, their breathing deep, and even for the first time in a week, they were safe. They were warm. She looked back at Jed. He wasn't glaring at her. He just looked incredibly tired. He had given up his solitude, his rations, and his peace, and he was angry about it. But he hadn't left them. Kara's shoulders slumped. The last of her civilized resistance drained out of her, leaving only the raw, pragmatic truth of survival. "Where do you sleep?" she asked quietly. Jed blinked, surprised by her sudden capitulation. He unbuckled his heavy leather belt, dropping it and his holstered pistol onto the table. "Floor by the fire," he grunted. He turned away, grabbed a battered iron pot, and went out the door to pack it with snow for water. Kara sat on the edge of the bed. The cabin was ugly. The man was rough. But as she listened to the crackle of the fire and the steady breathing of her children, she pulled the heavy bear pelt tighter around her shoulders. She was alive, and for the first time since the wagon axle broke, she believed they might stay that way. If you felt the chill of the Wyoming wind and the raw grit of Kara's survival, hit that like button to let us know. Real history wasn't a fairy tale. It was dirt, desperate choices, and finding hope in the harshest places. Share this story with someone who loves grounded, emotional Western dramas, and don't forget to subscribe. We bring you deep, human stories every single week. What do you think Jed and Kara's winter will look like? Tell us below.